Hello friends, welcome back to your channel. This is yet another video in the series Build Your Own Forms, and let me give you a very quick recap. So in the last video we implemented some validation directives, and we also saw how ng model inject these validation from outside. So let me give you a very quick walkthrough what we have done so far. So basically the validation in the template driven form is applied through the directives. We call them validation directives. So for each validation there can be one validation directive. So there are many validation directives which are already provided by the Angular itself, that is required validator, min length, max length, and whatever. And it also let you define the custom validation directives. Okay, so first you define the directive, then apply the directive selector on the host element. Host element is the element where you have already attached the ng model directive. Okay, the ng model is responsible for the two-way data binding, so it is also validating the data basically which you are providing to the input, or the changes you are making in this input. So that is also validated by the ng model, but ng model don't have that validation logic, rather it is injecting it from the outside, right? And so whatever directives we have applied on this host element, all these directives, they are configuring this di token ng validator. So it is a multi-provider di token, and ng model simply inject this di token, and through this it get access to these validation directives. So there are two steps here. First, the validation directives of it, whichever validation directive is applied here, they configure this di token, means they expose themselves as a service on this di token, and ng model simply inject this di token, and through this dependency injection it get access to the array of validators. Okay, and then it can simply compose a single validator function and pass it on to the form control, so that whenever ng model call the set value method on the form control, the form control can simply call the validator function, pass the data to it, and validate it. So in this video we are going to optimize our validation directives which we have already created in the previous videos, and we are basically going to create one abstract validator directive class. So this is an abstract class which will abstract away all the common functionality which we are repeating, okay, across different validation directives. Okay, so let's move to the code and browse through the form source and directive folders, and this is our validator.ts which holds all our validation directives, right? Required validator, min length, or whatever directive we define, we will keep them here in this file validator.ts. So here you can see like what we are doing actually in each of the validation. So basically each validation directive provides this validate method which has the logic to validate the data, right? So this is our required validator. Similarly, this is our min length. Another thing you can notice, like each validation directive, it might accept some input properties, right? So in the min length, it accepts one input property by the name min length. So if you see this plus operator behind this, so what we are doing basically, we are trying to normalize the data type of the input property which is accepted by the validation directives. So another thing is the normalization. First is defining the validator which will validate the data. Another thing is like normalizing the inputs, right? So these are the things we are doing, we are supposed to do in every validation directive. So instead of repeating it, what we can do, we can make it more structured, and we can create an abstract class out of these validation directives. Let me quickly define abstract validator directive. The first thing our abstract class should do is define this validate method. So for that we should implement this interface validator. So let's quickly implement it. For now we can keep it empty. Okay, so the next thing is like we should define the validator function, right? So to hold the validator function, let's define one private property, let's say validator, and this is what is this is a validator function, and let initialize it with a null validator. Okay, so what is null validator? Let me define it. This is the default implementation of the validator function, means it does nothing, it doesn't validate anything. Okay, So now comes the next thing, like we should define our validator function, right? Now who should define the validator function? So this class will put a restriction on each child class to implement one abstract method by the name create validator, right? And which will basically return the validator function, because it is the responsibility of this child class which will extend this abstract validator directive to define their validation logic, right? So the base class will simply call this, and this will return the validator function which it can assign it to its private variable validator. Okay, and when the validate method is called from the ng model, so if you see in the ng model, when we compose our validator function from the array of validation directives, right, from array of these validation directives, so what it did, it composed a single validator function, and it basically called the validate method on each of the validation directive, right? So when this method is called, we can simply call the this dot validate, right, this dot validator, because it holds the validator function which we have created through create validator. Okay, and what, simply pass the control, that's it. Okay, and there is one more thing, when we are calling the create validator, so we will pass the input property, right, having type unknown for now. So what is this input property? So if you go to the app component, you see when we are applying the validation directive, we are passing some input data as well, right? Like to the minlength, we are passing here as a string 3, right? But we can also pass it as like this number. So we can pass the data of different data types. So it's good, it's always good to normalize the data type to a single data type, right, which the validator function can work with. So basically what we will do, inside our base class, we will normalize this input data, okay, which we can read through the ng on change hook, like what properties are provided and what properties are changed. So we can normalize those input data and pass it to the create validator, so that the create validator can make use of it, like as you saw in this like how we make use of this minlength property, right? So now how you will normalize it, so that also should be implemented by the child class, because at some point you might be required the integer, at some point you might be required the input property as something like let's say boolean, right? So we will create one more abstract class here by the name normalize value. Okay, so let's go to the validator.ts and define one more abstract method, normalize input. Okay, so it basically takes the input of type unknown. So base class doesn't know what data is passed to the directive, it simply pass it to the normalize input, and normalize input method will return some data type, again we are not sure, right? So this is again, these two methods will be implemented by each child class. Now comes the point, like how should I call the create validator, right? So let's implement one interface. So Angular provides one interface on changes which will implement this ng on change hook, right? So this this lifecycle hook will be called every time there is a change in the directive input property, right? So let's define it here. So what we are going to do basically, like this is our base class and this is our, let's say, required validator, this is our child class, so it will basically extend it, right? So it is expecting some input property, right? Like this, like in the minlength we are expecting minlength as a input property. Similarly in the required validator we will define the input property by the name required. So which property I should check, right, in the base class? So base class doesn't know like which input property it should read, so it is, because it is a base class, right, it will be extended by all the child classes. So it is the responsibility of child class to define like what property the child class is expecting. So define one more input property, one more abstract property by the name input name, right? So this is the input property name, and what it is going to be, it is going to be string. So the child class will tell like I'm a required validator, I expect the required property. I'm a minlength validator, I expect the minlength. Okay, so the base class will basically check every time, like if the child class property, if the property which is defined by the child validator directive, if it is changed, then we should prepare the validator. Every time it is changed, every time we should update our validator function. Okay, so we will see like if this dot input name in changes. So inside the ng on change we get this changes object, right, of type symbol changes, which will have the updated value of the input property. Okay, so the first thing so if we have this input name property, and so what we will do first, we will basically normalize the input property, right? So we will call normalize input, and we will read the input property name, that is changes dot so we can read the input property name inside the changes object, and we can read the current value. Okay, and we pass it to the normalize input. So this is the child, this is implemented by the child validator directive class, which will normalize according to its logic. Okay, and then we can do the next thing is like we can call the create validator, and we can pass it the normalize input data, right? So this will create our validator function, right? So that's all. Why it is throwing error, let me show. So this is the directive, so we should decorate it with the directive decorator. That's it. All right, so next thing is we should extend our base class. So now since it is this validate method is already implemented in the base class, we can remove it, and we can remove this implement validator, and we can extend the base class, that is abstract validator directive. Okay, and let's implement it. So once you implement the abstract class, you will have to provide the implementation for all the abstract methods and properties. Okay, so right now the required validator is not accepting any input property, but we should accept one input property so that we can enable or disable the required validation. So let's me define one input property first. I'll name it required. Okay, and we should expect it of type string or boolean. Okay, so inside here in app component.html we can pass either something like true or true, or we can leave it empty as well, right? So okay, so this is a non-null value, keep it as like this, and in the input property basically we are reading the input property by the name required, so just set it here so that our base class is aware of like when this directive is applied, what is the input name it should check in the changes object, right? So so let's define our normalize method first. Basically what we are doing, so we are expecting here it to be string or number, and we are going to return boolean, right? Let's define one utility to convert the string and boolean to the boolean. Okay, so let's define it here, export function to, let's say, to bool. We check first if the type of the input is equal to boolean, we can simply return the input as it is. Otherwise we treat input as a true value if it is not equal to null, and if it is not equal to false string. Okay, and we can simply call this to boolean inside our normalize input, right, and pass it the input. Okay, next thing is defining the validation logic in the create validator. So what it does basically, so we will define our validation here, and I'll name it export required validator. Take the input which is of type boolean, and it will return the, so if we have the input, otherwise we return the null validator, right? Means if the input value is false, then we don't need to validate, we don't need to apply the required validation, right? So what it is returning, basically it is returning either the null validator or so basically, yeah, so what it is returning, it is returning the validator function, right? So this defines our validator function, required validator function. Otherwise what we'll do, we return the validator function, right, which takes the control of type abstract control and returns the validation errors or null, right? So it simply checks if the control value is so it's the same logic, nothing different. If we have the control value, then we can return null, otherwise there is a validation error, so we can return the validation error like this, required true. Okay. So you see we have extracted away the validation logic from the validation directive, right? So like in case of minlength, if you see, we have closely tied our validation logic to the inside the validate method, but if we keep them outside in a separate method, we can use them in the reactive form validations as well, right? Because in the reactive or in the template, both forms implementation provides the same validation, right, but in different ways. So it's good to keep the validation, core validation logic in a separate function so that we can reuse it. Okay, so this is my required validator, and next thing I'll have to do is call the return required validator, pass it the input, right? And what is input? Okay, so input is supposed to be here boolean, right? Because inside the create validator we are getting the normalized data, which is normalized by this class itself. If you see here what we are doing, we are normalizing the input data and passing it to the create validator. Okay, so now as you can see, instead of doing this, we can simply assign the create validator this one, right? There is no need to define the method again and again. So what we can do, we can simply do this. Similarly to the bool, we can assign this function to bool. Okay, all right, so this is my required validator. Now let me check if it is working fine. Okay, then we will update the minlength as well. Okay, so in the app component, let's say I'm just applying the directive here, and let's check if it is working. So yeah, it is working fine. So we have two validations. The first one which we just transformed using the abstract class, yeah, it is working fine. As soon as I enter something, yeah, first one just vanish. Okay, so now let's say if I pass something here, let's say false, so then this validation directive should be disabled, right? Okay, let's check. Yeah, it is disabled, right? It is disabled. Similarly, I can pass the boolean value as well. Let's say false and see. Yeah, so the required validation is not applied here, right? And if I pass something, let's say true, then it should apply the required validation. Yeah, it is. So you saw how we transformed our validation directive and we make it more structured. So it is very easy to create the new validation directives now. Okay, and similarly we can refactor our minlength validator, right? So now you see how much we have optimized our child validation directives, right? Okay, so let's check if the second one is also working, and let's say we pass it. Okay, so let's check it with the string 2. Let's update it. Let's check it with 3. Okay, yeah, 3. Again, if I pass something like integer, yeah, it is working fine. Yes. Okay, so this is all what I wanted to share with you. Okay, so that's all from this video, and I hope you like it. and share your feedback. Okay, thank you very much.